Good evening. I'd like to welcome this splendidly large and enthusiastic audience to the inaugural lecture of Professor Evelyn Welch. I'm Rick Traynor, Principal of King's College London, and it's absolutely delightful to see such a splendid turnout. It's a real tribute to Evelyn, and in a sense, her lecture has succeeded. She doesn't even need to give it now. But Evelyn is Professor of Renaissance Studies at King's and Vice Principal for Arts and Sciences. She came here just a little over a year ago in January 2013. And in the interim, she's made a very considerable impact in her Vice Principal's role. Building on the work that she did at Queen Mary, where she was Dean of Arts and then Vice Principal Research and International, and roles that she had before then at the University of Sussex, where she was head of the history of art and later Pro-Vice Chancellor for Teaching and Learning. At King's, Evelyn has brought new vision and coherence to the four schools in our arts and sciences category. And she's also, with the assistance of her vice principal colleague, Robert Leckler, who's also here this evening, done a lot of work on strengthening links between these two groups of schools, which is music to my ears in particular. But we're here tonight not so much to celebrate Evelyn as the academic manager, as Evelyn as the leading academic. And so to go back to her own education, she was an undergraduate at Harvard, where she got her bachelor's degree in Renaissance history and literature, and later she obtained her doctorate from the Warburg Institute. She's held academic posts at Essex, at the Warburg, twice over indeed, at Birkbeck, and also alongside her academic leadership posts at Sussex and Queen Mary. And I think without exaggeration, one can say that she has produced outstanding research and teaching. And you don't have to believe me, because Evelyn has compiled what, if it isn't a unique double distinction, is certainly a very unusual one, having received one of the National Teaching Fellowships from the Higher Education Academy, but also having won the Wolfson Prize for History, along with a number of other research-related awards and fellowships. And among her many other academic achievements, I think it's worth noting that she has successfully supervised a truly phenomenal number of doctoral students, a fair number of whom are probably present this evening. She also holds some significant positions of academic and cultural responsibility. She's a trustee of the Victoria and Albert Museum, whose director, happily, we have with us here this evening. She's a REF panel member, and she's on the editorial board of Past and Present. And she's also produced a very large number of important publications, many articles and book chapters, and she's the author, or in one case the co-author, of 4 substantial books. Art and Authority in Renaissance Milan, which came out in 1995, Art and Society in Italy, 1350 to 1500, which she published in 1997. Shopping in the Renaissance, Consumer Cultures in Italy, 1350 to 1600, which appeared in 2005, and that was the book that won the Wolfson Prize. And most recently with James Shaw, Making and Marketing Renaissance Medicine in 2011. So this is a truly remarkable academic career, which is very much in progress. And I think we all await with keen anticipation her lecture on Thinking Through Things, Fashionable Goods in Early Modern Europe, 1500 to 1750. Evelyn.
Thank you, Rick. Thank you. Thank you, Rick. And thank you very much to my colleagues, family and friends who are here, And I'd like to pay a particular tribute to the School of Arts and Humanities for organizing this event, and particularly to Pelagia Pace for doing such a wonderful job of getting me here and getting you all here in good order there. And I'm particularly pleased and grateful to see so many of my colleagues from the Victoria and Albert Museum, for as I think you'll see through this lecture this evening, the V&A has literally shaped the way I think. Its colleagues, its building, but above all its collections have changed my ideas in quite formative ways. And this lecture grows out of work that I've been doing, as Rick has indicated, for many years, particularly over the past 10 years, almost 10 years, since Shopping in the Renaissance was published. And that book looked at how you bought things, where you went to get the goods that you needed, both for everyday living and then for extravagances, like an antique Cupid there. And I was particularly interested in the complexity and the highly gendered nature of consumption practices in Renaissance Italy, arguing for the importance of geographic, spatial, and temporal ways in which people made their choices, and indeed for the multiplicity of values that could be ascribed to goods at any one time. And this, in turn, had grown out of an even earlier project, the Material Renaissance, which I undertook with Professor Michelle O'Malley, who's also here this evening. This asked a really simple question. Michelangelo was paid around 500 scudi for painting the Sistine ceiling. What could he buy with it? The answer, like any good academic answer, was, well, it depends. No. It depends on was he paid in cash or, as is more often, in kind. Did he know the person from whom he was buying something, or was this a stranger to stranger transaction there? It could even depend on the time of day, the time of year, and the weather into question. And the contingent and highly contextualized nature of value remains central to my research. And I've now taken it in a slightly different direction, working with slightly different materials, but the question remains the same. How do you know what you want? Why are you willing to pay for it there? What are the things that consciously or unconsciously shape our desires there? And in a world, early modern Europe between the 16th, 17th, and 18th centuries, a world in which your wardrobe was often more, if not as expensive as your land, your house, your horse, your tools, and certainly more expensive than your paintings, understanding the economic decisions that underpinned what you wore on a day-to-day or very elegant occasions is extremely important there. It's as much about economic assessments as it is about social critique. So in this paper, I'm going to argue that the small scale, the ephemeral, the decisions about how to wear something as much as what to wear created knowledge, connections, and networks that were fundamental to economic survival in the early modern period. As Craig Muldrew has shown, people were assessed not only for the intrinsic value of their own possessions, but for those of others on whom they could call in times of crises there. And I became particularly interested in these questions, not surprisingly, around 2007, 2008, when I noticed that there were particular challenges, not only in the UK, but globally. And I was struck by the fact that at that time, people, instead of wearing their scarves like this, or like this, started to wear them like this. You'll all remember this. It was a small gesture, but it spread in extraordinarily quick time speed. And now, of course, you don't see anyone, not even Nicholas Coleridge, wearing his scarf like this now. There. Today, the question is, why do young men in their 20s think it's attractive to have very large beards? So the issue of how, why, who, what are the mechanisms in a period before mass media, in a period when media which can circulate globally is only just beginning? How does this happen? To start with, I'm just going to use one example, a particular headdress known as the fontange, and then go on and look at a range of the complexities of the evidence we have in front of us to answer this question, before finishing with two case studies, a full face mask, the vizard, and a woman's muff, in order to try to show you at least how I'm approaching the answer to the question. And I'll give you a pre-warning. The answer to all these questions is more research is required, especially more funded research is required there. But let's start with the fontange there. That is this large headdress, which you can see on these three women here. In 1690, the Swedish pastor Nicholas Bergius in Stockholm published a diatribe against low-cut gowns and the lace and muslin headdress known as the fontange, identifying them as the dual bellows of vice that fanned male lust there. And I'll just cut to the final bit. The deadly sins of lust and vanity are the high fontange and the bare breasts. Of the two bellows of lust, the fontange is the one and the bare breasts are the other. Bergius's concerns about this new elaborate headwear in Sweden were expressed in other formats across the country. Just over a decade later, for example, further Swedish attacks on the fontange resulted in prints and ballads describing monstrous stillbirths of infants due to fontange-wearing mothers and the appearance of calves bearing the imprint of the high-wired hairstyle. Now, this sudden flurry of publications and attacks might suggest that the fontange, which you see here in two French prints from the 1690s, and here in two prints of the Queen of England and the nursemaid of the Prince of Wales there, were now popular in Stockholm, having arrived perhaps either via France, Holland, or here in Venice, two images from Luca Carnavalis of women on the streets in Venice. If so, it means that there had been a very rapid transmission from the Parisian court, where the style had been christened in honor of the King of France, Louis XIV's mistress, the Duchesse de Fontange, whom you see here, there. The story goes that she was riding with the king. As she went along, her headdress was caught by a tree branch, and she used her ribbon to tie up her hair, and that was the origins of this particular hairstyle. The story, of course, is told about 10 to 15 years after her death there. It has almost nothing to do with the actual origins, and I'll keep stressing, but it has to do with the need to provide a biography for fashionable objects in the period there. And indeed, this simple explanation of geographic spread from the court at Versailles, which certainly promoted itself as the center of all things fashionable, to the outer reaches of Protestant Europe, becomes more complicated when we start looking at it in greater detail there. And these are two dolls from the V&A collection, which show you how the fontange is actually manufactured out of wire, lace, and muslin there. Bergius was preaching to a French-speaking Huguenot congregation who might indeed have expected to have close connections with relatives back in Paris there, and indeed to wear Parisian styles of clothing, often associated with Catholicism there. He faced his own personal challenges. At that very moment, he was under attack for courting and marrying a member of the elite Oxenstierna aristocracy over the objections of her own family, a case that went to court where the preacher was found guilty. The sermon and its publication demonstrated his moral probity, something that would be beneficial to his case. And indeed, at the same time, in almost exactly the same year, the Congregation of French Protestant Refugees in Bern in Switzerland had taken a similar approach, banning the fontange and other headdresses of, quotes, many stories as a sign of their Protestant piety. In addition, the pamphlets circulating strange tales of animals and deformed infants were not necessarily inspired by French fashions in Stockholm, but by imported prints that were imitated there. The Swedish versions were closely related to contemporary English prints and ballads which have been studied by Claire Backhouse and Angela McShane there. And here you see the Somersetshire Wanderer here, in which the relation of a cow being within 8 miles of Bath, who brought forward a calf with the likeness of a woman's headdress, being a commode, another word for the fontange here, there. Thus, the story, the attack, the preaching, the prints, tell us as much about the transmission and consumption of print, of strict forms of Protestantism, of traditional anxieties about dress and immorality, and indeed about minority groups adopting dress which differentiate themselves from the wider community, as they do about the spread of fashion itself. And this is indeed a tale which I could tell in many different characteristics, particularly around the second half of the 17th century. For example, this is a pasteboard, again from the V&A, full scale, of a gentleman wearing fashionable dress around the 1690s. And I just ask you to notice his bow tie and his lace cravat there. And this miniature has been thought to come from Cologne there, again from around the same period. Two men wearing very similar wigs, very similar taste in lace and red ribbons there. This bow tie, you will not be surprised to know now, is known as La Vallière, after another of Louis XIV's mistresses there, and indeed is reproduced in this Grinling Gibbons wood carving here, again as very much a pinpointing of a particular moment in time when men across Europe were expected to wear this in homage to La Vallière there. In 1701, here you see, in this print, I just ask you to note the way this gentleman is wearing his cravat there, cravat again coming from Croatian troops there. This was the Steinkirk cravat. It was given its title from the 1692 Battle of Steinkirk in the southern Netherlands, where French troops supposedly didn't have time to tie their ties and therefore had to use this loose and now fashionable form, literally known as the Steinkirk there. In 1701, less than a decade after the battle took place, a French-English manual for would-be speakers were expected to learn the dialogue. What cravat or neckcloth do you put on today? A plain neckcloth. Steinkirks are no longer in fashion. Yeah. In 1711, The Spectator published a description that was designed to provoke laughter amongst its sophisticated readers, noting, and I quote, "I am informed that a fashion makes its progress much slower into Cumberland than into Cornwall. I have heard in particular that the Steinkirk has arrived but 2 months ago at Newcastle, and that there are several commodes among those parts which are worth taking a journey to see." Now, the reader of The Spectator in London, and indeed the reader of The Spectator in Newcastle, is expected to smile with wry appreciation of their metropolitan sophistication, of recognizing that rural inanity there. One's ability to talk about, to critique, to know what is new and novel is increasingly being transmitted by these new forms of consumption, not necessarily of neckcloths, but of print media itself there. Nonetheless, it was widely recognized in the media and outside that the changes in what was worn, and here are two examples from La Mercure Galante, a French equivalent from the 1680s and 1690s, which published a small number of plates which told you what to wear in winter and in spring when the court changes its fashion there, that the speed with which changes in fashion were taking place could have severe economic consequences. The large number of men, and particularly women and children, involved in these trades meant that the question of how tastes changed had impacts on employment, taxation, and trade. The starching of ruffs, which I'll come on to in a moment, the sale of human hair, the manufacture of stockings, knitting, lace making, were all crucial forms of employment designed to give the poor worthy tasks to do. In 1682, for example, Matthew Bedell noted that in the small town of Rothwell in West Riding in Yorkshire, I quote, "The inhabitants make great store of bone lace, whereby their poor are employed and themselves much enriched." And by 1688, Gregory King could point to the annual consumption in England of 50,000 muffs, worth a total of £10,000, and an estimated total of 200,000 masks, busks, which is a stiffening piece placed in a woman's bodice, and fans, which were also worth around £10,000 there. So legislators were acutely aware that if demand lessened, those who relied on such manual labor were in danger of further impoverishment and of becoming a burden on the state there. So thus, in 1688, the same year that Gregory King toted up the English GDP, the editor of the Mercure Galante noted the damage done to poor workers when a particular way of wearing ribbons changed. And I quote, "Ribbons are no longer in fashion, à la mode, and they are almost never placed on the shoulder. You should know, my lady, that the king never wears them. They are seen as inconvenient and in the way, as they get knotted up with his hair. This style grew out of ribbons which were attached on the shoulder to tie on the sword belt. But these are no longer necessary, as we only wear belts now, and one can easily pass as one wishes, so they are entirely useless. One wears very few ribbons on the shoulders, in such a way that if the knots are entirely turned in like those of the shoulder, one sees no more ribbons, so that it is thought will be almost impossible for this style to last, because one will be dressed too singularly. It seems unlikely that the young will want ribbons because they don't seem very novel, and that an infinite number of workers who know no other type of work will become miserable." And this is a theme which continues throughout the 17th and the 18th century. So by 1765, for example, British wig makers petitioned George III in that year to grant them relief, I quote, "in consideration of their distressed condition occasioned by so many people wearing their own hair." Now, to understand the interrelationship between fashion, labor, knowledge, and skill is not something you can really get from texts itself. You need to actually understand how something is made in order to realize that the fontange, with its wire and lace, is actually made out of almost exactly the same materials as this collar here, in that it's held up by a stiffened wire and pleated material. And that the crucial thing that all of them share, along with the ruff, which I'm just going to pause on, is the key skill of starching there. And starching is something that's absolutely central to understanding the early modern ruff and its success, for example. I'm just going to pause and try to explain how you make a ruff in order to ensure that we all understand the sheer amount of labor that is involved. Here you see in this monkey print just stand back here, the start of the process and the completion of the process there. So these ruffs, which we see in numerous Dutch and English paintings of the 16th and 17th centuries, have not been the focus of considerable historical attention, I have to say. And yet the processes which are involved, here is the client bringing her ruff in, are less to do with the making of the ruff, and I'll show you, and more to do with the cleaning of the ruff. So as you can see, it's simply, in this case, linen fabric, which is pleated and then sewn onto a collar and then sewn onto a shirt. But in order to stiffen it, you have to starch it. Here you are, we're boil washing it, and then you actually have to set it using poking irons. And then you need, and these are the poking irons here, and then you need to sew it back onto the shirt. It gets dirty very quickly. So to keep your ruff clean, you have to imagine repeating that process over and over again. Unstitching, unpicking, boil washing, restarching, setting, sewing back on. Many hands involved, and we had a go at doing this ourselves in order to demonstrate it. This is Jenny Tiramani, who does a lot of the clothing for the Globes, teaching us how to make a ruff from scratch there. And what we learned is that we were lousy at ruff making, and that it took an enormous amount of skill to do this effectively there. Equally, when you go into collections and have the privilege of working with curators, this is Leslie Miller here, to whom I'd like to pay specific tribute because she's been phenomenal, the curator of fashion at the V&A, absolutely phenomenal in working with myself and the PhD students and postdocs and other colleagues in our Fashioning the Early Modern project. When you're working with people who actually can take you through the complexities of how something is made, it is really only then that you understand the sheer amount of hours and skill and multiplicity both of vertical and horizontal networks that are required to make many of the objects in question. And indeed, it's only when you have the privilege of working with colleagues in museums that you can start to look at things which are so important to the understanding of how you think through things, that is unfinished things. There is nothing like the half-made to reveal its manufacture, as with these unfinished late 16th century Elizabethan gloves here. I've been particularly fortunate to work not only with museums such as the Victoria and Albert Museum, which collect for quality, but also for museums where their focus is primarily archaeological. Because the things, I should say, every pair of gloves in the Victoria and Albert Museum appears, at least in its initial collecting, to have belonged to Elizabeth I. There. It's when here we are in the Danish National Museum here. It's when you start working with archaeological collections that you can start to connect, if you like, the elite objects with the non-elite objects. This is my ring guard here, who's a conservator from the National Museum of Denmark. And this is a collection of knitted garments found in the moat around Copenhagen there. So we know when the moat was filled in the mid-18th century, so we absolutely know that these cannot be after around 1750 there. And it's a very wide range of objects, over 10,000 pieces of knitwear that we were able to look at and to study there. I imagine many of you didn't realize that the pearl stitch only comes in the 16th century there, making it possible to do all kinds of things with stockings that I never knew were possible until I started working with there. Here are a number of gauntlets recovered, and you can imagine the situation. You're leaning over to do some wonderful gesture and you lose your glove immediately there. So here is a suite of late 17th, early 18th century knitted gauntlets from Copenhagen, which imitate in fine detail a lot of the leather gauntlets that were popular throughout Europe there. So when you think about how do these things transmit not only over time, over place, and over materials, you can really only think this through the things themselves, through actually looking at the object. You're not allowed to take them apart, even in the V&A there, but you are allowed to X-ray them to understand what their structure is, which starts to create genealogies there. And it's putting together the combination of the thinking you can do with things, with all of the other material, which carries its own rhetorics around it, which I think allows us at least to come close to answering the questions of why did somebody think that this was an attractive and effective kind of garment to wear around 1720 there? How did you make a choice between one type of glove and another type of glove? When was it appropriate to wear leather? When was it appropriate to wear wool? Did they carry the same significance? Were they read in different ways there? So in this bit of the talk, I want to look at some of the other rhetorics that help to explain how people conceptualized and explain to themselves how fashion moves there. And I'm just showing you some of the accessories that belong to one of these fashion dolls in the Victoria and Albert Museum there, including the cravat, which I showed you earlier there. So for many commentators and satirists there, how fashion moved was extremely straightforward. Fashion, by its very definition, à la mode, was foreign. If you were English, it came from France. If you were French, it came from Italy. If you were Italian, it came from France. If you were Swedish, it came from France. The only people who thought that fashion was foreign were the French, who definitely knew it was Italian. Yeah. So fashion moves, according to John Stowe. Women's busks, muffs, fans, periwigs, and bodkins were first devised and used in Italy by courtesans, lower-class women, from thence brought into France, and there received the best sort of gallant ornaments, and from thence came into England about the time of the massacre in Paris. That's the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre, from which there is a Huguenot exodus there. And indeed, in 1616, the poet Ben Jonson started to create this very visceral sense of the Englishman who ceased to be English because of his Frenchifiedness. So on the English monsieur, would you believe, when you this monsieur see, that his whole body should speak French? Not he. That so much scarf of France and hat and feather and shoe and tie and garter should come thither, and land on one whose face durst never be toward the sea further than halfway tree, that he, untravelled, should be French so much as Frenchmen in his company should seem Dutch. No. But this notion of à la mode monsieur was something that, of course, was attacked as much in Germany as it was in England there. And there's a suite of prints which are very popular precisely this time, around the late 16th, early 17th century, attacking and showing the way you used to be à la mode in old Germany, and now you're à la mode in new Germany. And of course, with scatological, appropriately scatological humor, warning you against taking this as advice there. And you can even sing along to Al modo monsieur. And other satires show you that it's not just women who are foolish here, it's also men who are coming in to purchase a whole range of new forms of mustaches and beards here. Just to show, each one of these mustaches and beards is numbered so that when you go back, you can see exactly which one that they're trying to pick there. Again, a satire on the way that things are actually sold in the increasing number of catalogues that are emerging in the period there. And indeed, it's again these prints which are circulating as a form of warning as much as the fashions themselves. This Dutch print is bilingual in Dutch and in French and is one of a many number of attacks. But I want to use this print not only to continue talking about the circulation of satire, the ways that people conceptualized how fashion was circulating in Europe at the time and how dangerous this was. Obviously, you see that the à la mode modistes here are all devils there. But to talk about one particular case study. And I just ask you to look at this face here and this face here and these masks here. Because I'm going to focus on this mask, sometimes known in English as the vizard there, after visage. If you look closely, and I'll just remind you where we are, you can see that this woman is wearing a fashionable headdress, sometimes known as Dutch ears, there, wire and starch. She has a very newly fashionable, light lettuce-like ruff. She has her earrings. She's got some pulled out hair here. You can see her eyes. You can see her nose. And her mouth is just here. There is one of these vizards that was found in Northamptonshire in a house that was being knocked down, a house from the 17th century there. It was quite common to place old objects of clothing in doorway lintels and in windows in order as an apotropaic device to keep out bad spirits there. And this, it's in velvet here and buckram. And I just ask you to notice this string that's there. You can see front and back. And here's the bead that was found with it. Because the way this works, and you can see this from the Lady Clapham doll, and this is the two dolls that I've been showing a lot of their accessories to you there, is that there is a bead here attached to the mouthpiece. So what you do as a woman is you put this on your face, you put the bead in your mouth, and you go, you suck it in, and that holds on the vizard for you. Having the useful attribute of keeping it on your face, obviously, but also preventing you from speaking there. And this is explained very clearly in Randall Holmes. The second form of mask is the vizard mask, which covers the whole face, having holes for the eyes, etc. And this kind of mask is taken off and put on in a moment of time, being only held in the teeth by means of a round bead fastened on the inside over and against the mouth there. Now, I can trace this vizard form back to the mid to late 16th century. So it is 100 years before Randall Holmes is describing it here. This is a so-called album amicorum from around the 1580s. This is a French album amicorum from around the same time. This is slightly later, a manuscript from the British Library showing a woman in a cart, it's a cart here. And indeed, you can then take it up to the early 18th century. I hope you can just see Matteo Ricci's St. James Park. The woman here has got this black mask on, as do these women over here, there. Now, you could argue that this was an appalling, very difficult situation. How in the world could you be in a social environment in which women were kept silent by having to hold their fashionable masks in their mouth there? And indeed, in the early 18th century, the German ambassador in London, Baron von Pillnotz, was surprised to observe the ladies here have little to employ them, their amusement being to have the pleasure of being seen. This is the motif that takes them to the public walks, concerts, and theatres. And as for the rest, the women enjoy great liberty. They turn out in the morning with a black velvet mask on their faces, a coif in the shape of a hat with the brims down, a round gown and an apron, and in this trim they go to the park or for wherever they please there. And here are some of Luca Carnevali's images of women in Venice from around the same time there. Again, fully covered, and here in a mask for indoor use there. If we just unpick what the German ambassador is saying, far from actually being a method of imprisoning women, this is actually a mechanism for allowing them the freedom of the streets. Unrecognizable, unrecognized, they can move about where anonymity allows them liberty. And indeed, this causes tremendous anxiety there. A particular device that was originally used, supposedly, to protect the face from external environments, from harsh winds and from sunshine, has now been a device that allows women to walk freely in the park there. But it's not only in exterior spaces, it's also, by this stage, in the interior. So on Friday, July the 2nd, 1663, the diarist Samuel Pepys noted a relatively new mannerism, which, I quote, he says, has of late become a great fashion amongst the ladies. Here at the Royal Theatre, I saw my Lord Falconbridge and his lady, my Lady Mary Cromwell, who looks as well as I have known her, and well clad. But when the house began to fill, she put on her vizard, and so kept it on all the play, which has of late become a great fashion amongst the ladies, which hides their whole face. So to the exchange, to buy things with my wife, amongst other, a vizard for herself there. So the vizard, if you like, has been around for almost 100 years. It's been available for 100 years, but now there is a new space and a new place and a new way of wearing it, which demonstrates, A, that you know what it is, B, that you've been to plays with royalty, and C, that you know where to get one itself there. By 1693, however, the playwrights themselves had been so concerned about the use of the vizard that they start to attack it. But stay. Methinks some vizard mask I see, cast out her allure from mid-gallery. About her all the fluttering sparks, the young man, are ranged. The noise continues, though the scene is changed. Essentially, the playwright is complaining, here's Dryden complaining, that no one's paying attention to his play. They're all busy paying attention to this young woman there. Now growling, sputtering, walling, such a clutter, 'tis just like puss defendant in a gutter. Fine love, no doubt, but ere 2 days or o'er ye, the surgeon will be told a woeful story. Let vizard mask her naked face expose, on pain of being thought to want a nose there. Because, of course, the vizard becomes increasingly associated with sexually available women. Here you see Pietro Longhi's image of the exposition of a rhinoceros in Venice from the mid-18th century. And here what looks like a fresh young countrywoman with her face covered by a vizard is being brought forward by a procuress there. So masking anonymity can move from the protection of the face against the sun to a symbol of prostitution, sexuality, with an intermediate stage of sophisticated metropolitan theatre-going, absolute desirable fashionableness there. And indeed, it is women themselves who come up with the new mechanisms and seemingly teach each other how to use these items. If you understand how much time it takes to put a headdress like this together, you will realize that the last thing you want to do is to try to tie a mask either under or over it. So the ability to put something on at your leisure, and then to take it off at your leisure is actually something that gives women freedom rather than restriction, becoming like the fan, a way of deciding when and by whom and under what circumstances you want to be seen there. My final example, which is in part designed to demonstrate how difficult it is to capture the ephemerality of things in this period, is the muff there, which you see in two engravings by Wenceslas Holler, a Bohemian artist who works in Germany, in Antwerp, and in London here. Very few fur muffs survive, but there are a range of rather beautiful ones in coloured feather, in silk, and other forms of embroidery in museum collections around the world there. Muffs, again, I can take back to the late 16th century. Here's a very nice English example, a French example from 1595 from that same album Amicorum there. And they very much remain in use throughout the 17th, 18th, and indeed well into the 19th and 20th centuries there. Fascinatingly is the way that they become gendered. As you'll see from this Dutch ice skating image there, the woman here wears a muff while all her very active male colleagues, of course, wear gloves there. But the muff was not exclusively female and was often used by fashionable young men in the early 18th century, worn around the waist, but leaving their arms free to use their swords, whereas women were deliberately unable, again, to use their hands while holding a muff there. Now, Wenceslas Holler, who did a suite of engravings in the 1640s, was, it's fair to say, obsessed with muffs and other forms of furwear there. Just so that you understand, this muff here and these here, martens and sables and other animals that are used to make muffs have belly fur and back fur, and what you're trying to do in these two different shadings is to demonstrate how the furrier has actually very carefully put the pelts together. Highly, highly attentive to the manufacture involved there. And I'm just going to run through a relatively random selection of Wenceslas Holler's prints from 1645 to 1649 there. And these are just single engravings of muffs and other fur pelts. He then uses them in a particular range of images that he does of women, from both women in London and women around the world. And again, I'm showing you this are a whole range of women, an Austrian woman, an Argentinian woman, a woman of quality of Antwerp, etc. These are mainly English women here. Now, the question that I have as an art historian is this because all these women wear muffs around Europe, or is it because he knows how to engrave muffs? Because he can put a muff in every woman's hand, and it looks quite sophisticated then. But that reinforcing nature of this is a sophisticated thing to purchase. The print itself is a new product. It tells you that women around Europe are wearing, in very different but quite similar ways, these wonderful, expensive but not too expensive pieces of fur there. And at the same time, poets and painters are putting a narrative around this object there. This is Richard Lovelace's, one of his Lucasta poems from 1642, Her Muff. "'Twas not for some calm blessing to deceive, thou didst thy polished hands in shagged furs weave. It were no blessing thus obtained, thou rather wouldst a curse have gained, than let thy warm driven snow be ever stained." And Animals such as stoats, for example, were thought to have tried to kill themselves rather than be defiled sexually there. Not that you feared the discolored cold might alchemize their silver into gold, nor could your 10 white nuns so sin that you should thus penance them in, each in her coarse hair smock of discipline. Nor hero-like, who on their crest still wore a lion, panther, leopard, or a boar, to look their enemies in their hairs, thou wouldst thy hand should deeper pierce, and in its softness rough appear more fierce. No, no, Lucasta, destiny decreed that beasts to thee a sacrifice should bleed, and strip themselves. So the very animals who've made her muff have given their furs to her, and stripped themselves to make you gay, nor yet herald did display. And for those of you who know your heraldry, sables on ermine has a very specific heraldic terminology. A coat where sables upon ermine lay. This for lay lovers that must stand at door, salute the threshold, and admire no more. But I, in my invention tough, rate not this outward bliss enough, but still contemplate must the hidden muff. Now that ability to create sexual imagery from one item of desirable merchandise is really quite extraordinary there. And it's also a tale of remarkable fashion survival there. In this talk, I hope what I've shown is that 3 impossible items, a very high piece of wire and lace, a piece of velvet which you hold in your mouth with a bead, and a fur piece that you shove your hands through and then can't do anything with your hands, not only grasped the imagination of men and women throughout Europe for over 100 years, but were then recast, redeployed, and re-employed, often by not just the women themselves, but by the women and their makers, who would work with each other to find new uses, new meanings, and new forms of repurposing old products there. So as I finish, I'd like to invite you all, as you leave today and join us in a reception afterwards, to think, did I wear this when I got up this morning? Man, what is it that I might wear tomorrow? And thank you for taking fashion seriously. Thank you very much.
Ladies and gentlemen, my name's Russell Goldborn. I'm a professor of French literature here at King's and head of the School of Arts and Humanities. I have the honour this evening of giving this vote of thanks in response to Evelyn's wonderful lecture. However, I don't feel entirely qualified to do so. In particular, with all this talk of fontange, stockings, knitted gauntlets, periwigs, bodkins, Dutch ears, cravats, starched ruffs, tippets, ribbons, muffs, and velvet masks, I feel remarkably underdressed. I'm also acutely aware that Evelyn recently held 2 AHRC collaborative doctoral awards, one to supervise a PhD student working on men and jewellery in early modern England, the other to supervise a PhD student working on early modern hygiene and underwear.
Both of them are here tonight.
So I don't undertake to give this vote of thanks unadvisedly or lightly, but reverently and soberly. I'm rather glad I had a shave this morning as well. But in another sense, I do feel qualified to give this vote of thanks. Evelyn and I are fellow early modernists. We share an interest in material culture, in things, in all their thinginess. And by looking, with the help of some marvelous illustrations, at a range of fashionable items from across Europe in the 16th, 17th, and 18th centuries, Evelyn has shown convincingly how these things are not passive or inert elements of society, somehow in contrast to the active force of human subjects, but rather they are things that do work and have effects, that are endowed with agency as they circulate in society and accumulate values and meanings. And what goes for early modern fashion goes for fashion now too. As one well-known contemporary singer-songwriter has put it, "When your life is over, I won't be sad or blue. I'll put on my fancy hat, lie down next to you. I'll kiss you once for life, I'll kiss you twice for death. Hold you close for comfort, wearing my best dress." Evelyn has demonstrated very elegantly and convincingly that subjects and objects, human beings and their fashionable items, are intertwined in complex ways. Objects do things and make us do things. They inflect and shape human action in various ways. These things are both instrumentalized and instrumentalizing. Fashionable items, both in the past and in the present, wear us just as much as we wear them. Evelyn may be a lousy rough maker, as we've discovered, but she is a fantastic lecturer. So before you leave the hall in all your finery to attend the drinks reception upstairs in Chapters, I'd like to ask you to join with me in thanking Evelyn again for a wonderful inaugural lecture.
Very kind. Much appreciated. I'll take my props away with me.